Okay, everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the Pima County Library Foundation's Author Salon series. My name is Jason Lazaro, and I'm the president of the Pima Library Foundation Board. The foundation is a 501c3 and has grown through the years to become the private philanthropic partner of the library. The foundation funds library programs and supports the library's key strategic priorities. These private funds from individual donors, foundations, and businesses ensure that the Pima County Public Library is ready and able to serve our neighbors all across Pima County with top-flight collections, innovative programming, and critical community services. Most recently, the Pima Library Foundation, in conjunction with several area businesses, provided funding for an outdoor pavilion at the new Swarita Library. This pavilion will be used by the community for special events such as concerts, theater, speakers, and other programs to enhance the library patrons and the community at large. The foundation also supports and funds several programs for young adults, including reading programs and an online high school diploma program. To learn more about the Pima Library Foundation or to make a donation to help support our mission, I encourage you to visit our website, which is www.thepimalibraryfoundation.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Warner of the Arizona-Sonora Desert Museum. Ann?
Thank you. I appreciate it. And we very much appreciate being here today. I'd like to say thanks for joining us. We're excited to share tales of our new publication, Treasured Legacies, with you, and more tales of the Desert Museum. But I'd also like to introduce my co-panelists this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to introduce Craig Ivanyi, who serves as the executive director of the Desert Museum. Craig's been at the museum since February of 1984 in a variety of scientific and administrative roles, most recently serving as executive director since 2010. I'd also like to introduce the person on my right here, or left, depending on your screen. This is Peggy Larson. And Peggy Larson and her husband, Murph, first came to the museum in January of 1953, traveling over an unpaved Gates Pass road to view the museum for the first time. And Peggy currently serves as museum librarian and archivist. And I'm a longtime volunteer with the museum. My background is in public involvement and community relations, and I'm pleased to be a part of Treasured Legacies. And now we'd like you to meet our muse. This is Priscilla Baldwin, and we'd like to tell you a little bit about how Treasured Legacies came about. Priscilla is a highly talented and internationally recognized scratchboard artist. And over the years, she's begun to scratch images from Hal Gross's desert art. A friend of hers from New York mentioned in passing, "I'd love to see your artwork." An idea was born. But then who to tell the tale? And that's when Priscilla turned to Peggy, as Peggy and Murph had been there from the museum since its early days and knew well Hal's ambassador animals. So with Craig's support, a book began. But it soon became clear that there was more to share. And so we've created Treasured Legacies. It's a celebration of the Sonoran Desert and the messages of conservation, art, and education, featuring the Desert Museum's Art Institute, Hal Gross and the Desert Ark, the more modern program of Raptor Free Flight, closing with a look to the future. And today we'd like to share with you some of the images and tales of Priscilla's gift of life, celebrating ongoing successes in conservation stewardship. But before we get started on our tales, we'd like to share with you a little bit of background about some of the museum's conservation work. And I've asked Craig to brief us a little bit about the history of the conservation work at the museum and also some ongoing efforts. Craig, if you would, please.
You bet. Thank you, Ann. And thanks for being the ringleader for this entire project. The museum has a long history, very long history of engaging in conservation science and interpretation of what we actually learned from doing that work. And that's both in the biological as well as cultural contexts. From the early days and ever since, notable individuals have worked in a bunch of different subject areas and collaborated with others. And that's resulted in several amazing things, including the creation of Isla Raza as a preserve, which was to protect breeding populations of 3 different seabirds. And that actually helped launch conservation in the Gulf of California. And as a byproduct, you might look at the number of preserves that are in Mexico. 40% of them are in the Sonoran Desert region. So it's pretty amazing that all of that kind of stems from initial efforts of people at the museum. One man in particular, Lou Walker. We've also had very, very strong roles in the reintroduction of the Mexican gray wolf in Arizona and New Mexico. We did some of the foundational work that led to the creation of Ironwood National Forest. And another place down in southern Sonora called Rancho Montemajino, which is one of the best intact tracts of tropical deciduous forest at the northern extreme of where that area occurs. There are other things that we've been involved with for many, many decades. Those include the reintroduction of what's called the Tarahumara frog and a slew of other lower vertebrates over time. And as you look, I'm sorry, Ann, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, as you look, that's more of that deep history. As you get closer in, there are a variety of things that started way back, but they continue today. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of our work, is that it has decades of data and people that some that have transitioned over time, retired, and others take up that charge. And what you'll see on the screen now is where it says Save Our Saguaros. That's focused on invasive species. One in particular called bufflegrass, and that's one that threatens to change our Sonoran Desert into a Sonoran savanna. So there's been a lot of effort for many, many years, not just the museum, many partners in that. And the museum has kind of relabeled that so that people understand it's really about saguaros as opposed to about grass. And then that term migratory pollinators, pollinators in general, it started as migratory ones. Now we're really focused on bees. So understanding all of these different animals and the relationships they have to the plants in this region, those are some of the things that we're focused on as we look to the near term. And then just to add to that, there's a couple of other things: the salvage and stewardship of native species from our region, including Mexican garter snakes, Sonoran mud turtles, a variety of desert amphibians and fishes, and probably the most interesting thing to add to this, it's kind of a shift from looking at the sustainable food picture that we've always been connected with and actually transitioning that into a new area of research for the museum.
Thank you. I appreciate the background.
My pleasure.
And now we'd like to share with you some more elements from Treasured Legacies, and we need to talk about the Art Institute. Priscilla and her husband, Michael, are co-founders of the Art Institute. And the Art Institute has one overall goal, and that is education. It has classes, annually up to 200 course offerings with approximately 1,500 students. We also have 2 galleries. And this is one of them, Ironwood Gallery. There's also a Baldwin Education Gallery. And the galleries attract over 30,000 guests annually. And then the classes in the gallery exhibits are complemented by the Art Institute's biannual artist in residency program. And now it's fun, because now we get to talk about the Desert Arc and Hal and Noddy Gross. Hal and Noddy were important to the museum, and I'm hoping Peggy will tell us just a little bit about them. Please.
Sure will. Hal and Noddy were amazing people. Hal had never even had a pet when he was a child. He was a showman, he'd never had a dog. He was a showman as he handled the ark animals and presented them as the amazing creatures they were. He was almost childlike each time he took an animal out of its carrying cage to present it, usually to children. Personally, I personally found this rather remarkable, considering that he came to the museum after college, but preceded by service in the U.S. Army in Europe at the Battle of the Bulge. Noddy treasured each animal that came to them, curing them when needed or helping them attain a grown independent stage. She took care of them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and she loved each and every one of them. Jeannie, their young daughter, grew up with the animals. As an adult once said, when she was a child, she did not consider her family as different than any others, even though her family did have a young mountain lion settled in a baby's playpen in the living room while it watched TV on a nearby set.
And now we'd like you to meet some of Pal's special critters, and let's start with George L. Mountain Lion, who is truly the face of the Desert Museum. And can you tell us how he first came to the museum?
George L. came to the museum on George Washington's birthday in 1953. Merv and I were living at the museum at that time, and a lion was due to be delivered to the Tucson airport, and Bill Carr asked Merv to drive him into town to pick up the lion, and he graciously invited me to go along. I was very happy to accompany them. When we got to the airport, there was kind of a small crowd around a cage, traveling cage, animal traveling cage. There were noises coming from the cage, and the human crowd thought it was some terrible creature inside it. Actually, it was the lion, who was young and interested in people. He'd been raised by people, and he was talking to them and growling and talking to them. Anyway, we loaded George in his carrying cage in the back of the station wagon, and Bill and I sat there in the front seat, turned with our heads turned to the back, talking to George. He wasn't George yet, all the way back to the museum. He was so friendly that Bill Carr, who was usually very cautious where wild animals were concerned, invited Merv and me to go into the enclosure as his cage was open so that he could exit. So the three of us trooped into the enclosure. The end of the carrying cage was opened, and the lion began to emerge. He was not a little lion. He was a big lion. And he grew and grew and grew as he came out of that cage. Bill Carr said, "You need to get out of here. Get out." Well, the door to the enclosure was closed, but the three of us started toward it with a little bit of trepidation. We opened it and exited it. And I think if we looked back at the lion that became George, we would have realized that he was really a very friendly lion and wanted human company. So George was named George L. Mountain Lion, built by Bill Carr that day because it was George Washington's birthday. So he became George. He became the initial L for Leo the lion, and Mountain Lion, which is usually two words, was put into one for his surname. Thus was born George L. Mountain Lion. George and his personality expanded in the museum, and he began to write a weekly column. He also received mail, and he would answer it. The person who seemed to be in charge of George's correspondence was Hal Gross, who had joined the museum in various positions. And George became a very well-known lion personality in Tucson. And in fact, some child wrote a letter to him addressed at George, Tucson, Arizona, and it was delivered to the Desert Museum. There was no doubt about who was George in Tucson. He became the museum symbol. He wrote a weekly column for the Arizona Daily Star. He wrote letters to others who bore a strange resemblance to Hal's handwriting, and he received letters, as I said. Over the years, there have been other Georges who have followed the initial one. They have all been much beloved animals at the Desert Museum. We have treasured them all, and they have done a great deal for the Desert Museum and their species in general.
Thanks.
Mhm.
And now we want to hear more tales. And so let's meet some of Hal's special ambassadors. And I asked Peggy to pick just a few. You only get to see a sampling today. You have to go to Treasured Legacies to see the full complement. But we want to learn a little bit more about these special ambassadors and how they got their names. And so let's start with Julius, the gopher snake. Tell us about Julius.
Julius was a member of the Desert Ark, and the Desert Ark came about because Hal was beginning to know different kinds of animals. He had not known much about animals before, but he was becoming interested in the desert animals, and he loaded some of them in his old Dash, which soon became known as the Desert Ark, and began taking them to schools. He gave them strange names, which would not be done today. Hal was rather hopelessly anthropomorphic with his animals, but that appealed to children. It also appealed to quite a few of his adult audiences. So Julius became Julius Squeezer. You may resemble, that resembles Julius Caesar, because Julius killed his prey by constriction, hence Julius Squeezer. Portions of an adult audience in particular become uneasy or upset if somebody pulls a snake out of a bag rapidly. So when Hal, in giving his talks for the Desert Ark, was ready for Julius to come out, he advised his audience that he was going to take a snake out of the bag. He would reach in and take Julius out very slowly while talking about the role that Julius and others of his kind had in the desert environment. He explained about poisonous and non-poisonous snakes, and he advised children in general, leave them all alone. And that's a mantra that you hear even today by adult audiences or individuals who remember Hal Gross and the Desert Ark. Oftentimes, Hal said, leave them alone. And children took that in, where a lot of animals were concerned. At the conclusion of his presentation, Hal talked about Julius's role in nature and his importance and others like him. And at the end of his presentation, he offered to stand at the exit door. This was usually for children at school audiences, and allow them, each student, to touch the snake, because people sometimes thought snakes were slithery or slimy, and they are not, said Hal. They're dry and they have beautiful scales, and they feel very nice to the touch. So Hal would stand by the door, hold Julius, one hand behind his head and one hand near his tail, and invite the students as they walked out to go back to their classes to touch Julius's scales. Well, some of the girls squealed and some of the boys made a big show of bravery, but almost, due to peer pressure, almost every one of them touched Julius. And there are adults around today who tell me occasionally, the first time I ever touched a snake was when Hal Gross invited us to touch Julius, which is a very good feeling. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And now you get to meet Quilly Mays, the porcupine.
Quilly Mays was a fine member of the Desert Ark, and I think he appeared in well over 1,000 programs with Hal. He lived a long life, and he was a very willing participant in the Desert Ark and traveling to various locations. Hal used Quilly maze named for, let me talk about Hal's names. He named animals like Julius Caesar, and Quilly maze was named for a ball player. And the javelinas sometimes were named Olivia the Javelina or Gregory Peccary. The children usually caught on to this, and adult audiences thought it was really funny, and it sucked them into watching too. Anyway, Hal would tell the children or his audience that despite the belief that porcupines can throw their quills and therefore they are dangerous to you, Hal would say they can't throw their quills, but if a quill gets stuck to a person or another animal with the sharp barb at the end of its hair, then it comes out of its body and it remains stuck in this new location. So Hal would take his finger and he would touch a quill or another one, and he'd end up with his finger looking like a pincushion. And he would tell the children it doesn't really hurt, and he didn't throw them at me. It was my own fault. I got them in my finger, and he would jerk them out. And the children learned a valuable lesson.
And then there's a very special Franny. So tell us about Franny the Badger.
Well, in the early days of the museum, there were very few or no animal rehab units in Tucson. And so animals in trouble usually came to the museum. And Hal and Noddy would take as many as they could, and Noddy took care of them. But occasionally one would go home with somebody on the museum staff in their care. And Franny was one of these. The museum had a resident rat badger who had been there for a long time on display. Her name was Ida. And Hal had a badger too in the Desert Ark who had a long residence there. Her name was BB. I'm not sure what BB stood for, and I'm sorry I never found out. I have a feeling, knowing Hal and Noddy, that probably BB stood for beautiful badger, because badgers are beautiful. Anyway, Franny came to stay with us to grow up. When she arrived, she would fit in the palm of my hand very easily. Her eyes were closed. She was a very, very new little badger. First night, she was upset and she was sleeping. I had a large size round ice cream carton. I put her in there with a heating pad and she was crying. We rushed around town and finally found a small bottle with a nipple that was made for a doll, but it was a perfect size for Franny. So we fed her a special formula. We put her in her bed, and I slept on my stomach all night with one hand in an ice cream carton, keeping a little badger somewhat happier than she had been. Franny grew up at our house. She was a wonderful animal. And we had two children. We had decided earlier that we would do a little bit of sex education with them. So we had a female cat who was due to have kittens, and we had a yellow Labrador dog who was slated to have puppies. And unbeknownst, unplanned for, we had Franny. So the house was full with a mama cat and 6 kittens and a mama dog with 11 babies in the garage. And Franny grew up with all of them. She had the run of our house when we were home. She had her own bedroom when we were not home. although she did destroy the mattress in there, but it worked out well for her and for us overall. We eventually moved her to an outside yard where we visited her, or particularly I visited her almost every night, usually when I was ready to go to bed, because that was when she was most active. I fed her ground beef, apple slices, and some dry cat food, but it was ground beef she liked best. She would come out of her burrow. She dug a burrow under the foundation of our house, which was under our bedroom. We frequently heard her working on her home at night as we were trying to sleep. She did a lot of redoing of her home from time to time. Anyway, when she came out at night, she loved attention, and even before she started to eat, she would flip over on her back so that I would scratch her white, fat, broad tummy. She was a wonderful, friendly animal. Only one time did she ever get upset or show any malice, and that was when Merv approached the opening to her underground burrow with the shovel. He'd been slicing at some weeds with it and came close to the opening to her home, and she attacked the shovel. She didn't bite Merv, but she did attack the shovel. Never did see her angry before or after that. Franny lived with us for a very long time. We used to visit her in her outside yard, especially on sunny mornings. She loved to be held. She loved to be scratched. She loved to see us. She tried to keep us from leaving her yard by grabbing a pants leg in her teeth and hanging on, but eventually we'd get loose. She was the most amazing animal I have ever been honored to have known. I loved her very much.
Thanks. Pretty special tale. But now we'd like to move forward and talk about some more modern day conservation programming. And this is Raptor Free Flight. Raptor Free Flight is at the museum is unique in that it focuses on birds native to the Sonoran Desert. All training is positive reinforcement based. And as you watch, you'll find out that the birds fly without traditional falconry equipment. And it's really special feeling as the birds sail over your head as you're watching them take to the Sonoran skies. But we'd like you to meet some of the individuals. And some of the individuals of Raptor Free Flight include Einstein and Dante, the show-off ravens. Einstein and Dante are best friends, and you'll see them playfully chase through the skies above the museum. And oh, are they smart, and they love to solve puzzles. And you'll see here some of the Legos that they love to play with. What they do is they'll search for their favorite blueberries as they watch for Lego towers. And then there's Little Bit, the great horned owl. Watch as she sails up from the desert floor to her perch at Cat Canyon. It's a delight to see her watching the visitors and to hear her as she contact calls a greeting, a funny little sound. And now you get to meet Squeaks, the crested caracara. Squeaks is a bit goofy, a lot quirky, and quite a crowd and volunteer favorite. When he's not sailing the skies over the museum, he can be found lying on his back, playing with his toys. And here's Sonora, the red-tailed hawk, who has a fairly miraculous story. Sonora is really good at catching snakes, and that was almost her downfall. One day, in a hunting attempt in the spring of 2014, she was bitten by a western diamondback rattlesnake and struck twice in the foot. When this happens in the wild, the attack is generally lethal. But thanks to a very close relationship between one of the museum's veterinarians and the Viper Institute at the University of Arizona, Sonora's life was saved. Today, Sonora is alive and well, sailing over the Sonoran Desert skies in Raptor Free Flight, and we want her to stay that way. And here we thought we'd give you a view of some of the faces of the volunteers and staff of Raptor Food Flight. It takes over 40 people to maintain this program. And the faces you see here are both some of the current ones and some of the historic ones that have helped us with the program. And we value their help and their assistance, their care and their training. So we've given you a little bit of background and told you a few tales, providing a little bit of history and talking a little bit about some of the more modern programs. But we'd like to look to the future. And so I've asked Craig if he would tell us a little bit about, in his mind, number one, what makes the museum special? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that museum and aquariums in general face in the years ahead? And what does that mean for the Desert Museum? Craig, if you would.
You bet. So your first question, what makes the museum special? There are so many things, and sometimes I think it's good to ask somebody that's new to an organization as opposed to a fossil like me that's been around for 38 years. But from my perspective, I think first and foremost, it's the mission of the museum and the multifaceted way that we actually approach delivery on that promise. Beyond that, the regional and immersed approach, it allows us to kind of flip the traditional worldwide approach of a traditional zoo or aquarium or garden. We kind of flip it on its head. So rather than being a mile wide and maybe an inch deep, we're actually about an inch wide and a mile deep. And that allows us to really have our programs with greater authenticity, and we can go much, much deeper and create a richer experience than others have that's possible for them. As I looked at challenges, and I guess every challenge, depending on who you talk to, is an opportunity. Museums, aquariums, zoos, gardens, pretty much any of these, especially attraction-based nonprofits, they all face challenges. And one of the biggest ones for all is economic viability, maintaining relevance, being able to continually appeal to people, and then meet the changing expectations on diversity, community engagement, animal wellness, and a whole lot more. And there's just a large list of unknowns. Of course, everybody is aware of climate change, invasive species, social justice, a lot of very, very dynamic, changing environments that we have to deal with, and it's a very unpredictable time. So as much as those are in some cases very scary, they are definitely things that we look to as opportunities. And maybe one of the things when you look at a regional organization specific to us, sometimes people will look at an organization and say, well, you don't have exotic things, so you're not as flashy, you're not as sexy as people that are bringing elephants and wildflowers from around the world. But we have the ability to show off the beauty of this region, which truly is exotic for many of the people that actually come to visit here. And then it helps to remind all of us, the residents, of how amazing this region is and that it is right in our backyard. So, I guess I'd look at it as like the near-term future is very exciting, challenging, but exciting. We're deeply engaged in long-range planning so that we can figure out what the next many years of the organization look like. And then we always have ongoing projects. There's a couple of them on the near-term horizon in the next few years called Right Prey and Adventure. And then the Mexican Wolf exhibit will make a new one. And we're deeply engaged in getting sustainable funding for conservation and science. So as much as all those challenges are out there, we have tremendous community and donor support, and this place is flourishing, and we look forward to an exciting future.
Thank you. And so I'd like to pose a final question to both you, Peggy, and to you, Craig. The museum opened on Labor Day, 1952. This year will be its 70th anniversary. What would you look like the museum to look like and to be on its 100th anniversary? Peggy, I'll start with you.
Okay. Well, I would like the museum to remain its current size or only a little larger. I would like visitors to receive an experience in addition to simply viewing the exhibits. And examples of experience currently at the museum, I would say I would include the Raptor pre-flight. That truly is an experience when you have the Raptors flying over your head. I think also going down into the cave can be classified as an experience. It was built some time ago, but one does feel that they are truly a cave explorer when they go down there. I would like to see the museum become a beacon for additional desert conservation work. And I would like to see it more concerned with work with children, for as Bill Carr always pointed out, children are our future.
Fred, back to you.
Okay. Well, I've got the cost and benefit of being in a dozen different roles and being director now for about a dozen years. And I guess I'll answer that question with kind of an eye back at those immense challenges that are on the horizon. When you look at climate change, invasive species, divisive politics, much, much more, all of those threaten the organization and, of course, the mission that we hold so dear. They also lead us to where not only is the organization something that you have to wonder about sustainability, you have to wonder about the sustainability of Tucson as a city and this region. And so I guess if I were to look at that 100th year, I'm really hoping that we're celebrating the Desert Museum as part of a vibrant community that's known for establishing itself as a model sustainable desert city. And beyond that, it's certainly my hope that the museum is celebrating the continuation of what Bill Carr and Arthur Pack had in mind all along. And that would include that we are economically viable, that there's a balance between tourists and residents, earned and philanthropic revenue, that we've built up reserves and endowments that allow us to sustain ourselves regardless of what's going on around us, that we continue to exhibit leadership in animal wellness and natural history exhibitry, and that conservation, education, and science, that we can actually find the most effective way to engage people so that we can actually get them to care and turn our mission into their mission.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So we've been pleased to share with you some tales and some views of the museum's conservation work. But in closing, we'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of Bob Edison. Bob Edison is a former executive director of the museum who was highly instrumental in making Treasured Legacies happen. So thanks for letting us tell our tales, and we hope to see you at the museum soon. And here's a slide that'll tell you where you can pick up your copy of Treasured Legacies and look at and then you can see the rest of the ARC animals and the rest of the Raptor free flight that are featured inside. Thank you.
Awesome, guys. That was a great presentation. We have some questions coming in. So I'll read those out to you. The first one was, where did George L. Mountain Lion live before he came to Tucson? And was he born in captivity?
I do not know, and I have not been able to find out. And I must admit, I didn't start searching until more recently, and I waited too long. Obviously, he had been raised probably in somebody's home, would be my guess, because he really was, he considered himself more a person, I believe, than a lion. And he was exceedingly friendly to everybody. He purred, he turned somersaults, if you can believe it. And he enjoyed having lots of company at his enclosure at the museum. He was a favorite.
And another question was, how was the site for the Desert Museum chosen?
Bill Carr had the idea for a living museum, such as he had been running in New York State. And he brought the idea to Tucson. And at a meeting, he met Arthur Pack, a meeting of the Pima Park Committee of some sort. And Arthur Pack came up with some money, and the two began to look for a place to establish a desert museum. I don't know who first suggested the mountain house, which had been built by the National Park Service in the late 1930s. It had been empty essentially and not used because it was finished about the time the Second World War started. And so that's how they zeroed in on the mountain house. And eventually, because of Tucson Mountain Park and connections there to that general area, it came about. And it was perfect. A better place could not have been chosen.
I agree. Peggy, here's one for you personally. Was Fran your personal favorite ARC animal? And did you have another one?
We had a beaver too that we were keeping until Hal could take it over. But Hal and Noddy were out of town. It was summer, and Murph flew to Jackson Hole and picked up this beaver that friends of ours had been using in filming. And they had named him Squirt. He was just a baby. And he came to live at our house until Hal and Noddy could collect him. But that was a memorable visit. He was still eating from a bottle. And so each night, just before bedtime, my daughter or I would sit in the rocking chair with a baby bottle full of formula and a baby beaver and feed him. There's nothing that compares to holding a baby beaver with its soft, fine fur and being so close to an animal. He eventually, when the Grosses got home, went to live with Hal and Noddy.
Okay, this one's directed towards Craig. The person asks, what about the museum's mission or goals brought you to start there?
So Jason, I would love to tell you that I had lofty goals of getting into conservation when I was in my mid-20s. I was studying at the University of Arizona, and I was actually thinking of my future and how I would actually ever get a job in something that actually had meaning. So somebody suggested, hey, I think they take volunteers out at the museum. So I just went out there with the eye of getting experience in something and having that in addition to a degree. And then, of course, once you're there, you get exposed to things. And the more you're exposed to it, the more it tends to be something that you have questions about, become curious about. And I've told people before that, I showed up there unannounced and uninvited, and been very fortunate that I've had a lot of different opportunities that allowed me to stay there. And now, once you're there for as long as I am, I think there's as much something about the museum that flows through your veins as much as blood does, and it becomes something that you really have a hard time ever getting away from.
It's an interesting story. Let's see. The next one is directed towards Anne. What made you choose to volunteer at the museum initially, and what keeps you in that role? So kind of similar to the question Craig answered.
Okay, it's actually kind of a long story, but I'll try to keep it simple. Peggy needed some help with her oral history project, and I came on as in a technical capacity to help her organize and digitize some of her early interviews. From there, we expanded the oral history interview process, and that was almost 12 years ago. So we are really excited about the oral history project. We've also created something called vignettes, which are posted on the museum's website, which helps us tell some of the people tales, shall I say, of the early days of the museum. So it was an interim process.
Okay, the next one coming in is, have there been any unanticipated surprises along the way in the development of the museum, either in animal behavior or external interventions that advance the mission of the museum?
So you can probably get different eras as far as answers with me and Peggy, but I'll start off, at least in my background. Yes, there's definitely things that pop in and out. I think the museum is a very interesting blend of, if you look at Bill Carr, he showed up from New York. So the fact that you have this outsider that shows up here and has a reverence for education about environments and comes up with the idea to start this at all, there's your first intervention, I guess you could say. There have certainly been others that have shown up that have helped along the way. But then there's an amazing balance of people that actually are from this community and then are there for a long time. So it's a blend of people that can bring outside influence, but also the ones that have a deep reverence for the past, like you're seeing with Peggy and Anne and me, that actually can steward the history and balance that with concepts of what the future might look like. Beyond that, there's of course external pressure that comes from organizations and individuals, certainly as far as animal welfare and wellness. And those are something that sometimes push organizations. The great thing about the museum is that it's often been on that kind of leading edge of how we care for animals, just by virtue of being regional. It's a very different scenario than what you see at a lot of organizations. So we're not trying to keep polar bears in a desert or tortoises in a blizzard. The things that we have, they occur here, so they're adapted to this climate already. So we have an edge, and I think it's a great model for others to consider of having more regional collections that fit better with the environment around them.
This is a question similar. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities the museum sees looking forward? And then the question about climate change.
Yeah, and in my mind, the biggest ones are the biggest unknowns and the ones that so few people seem to want to really turn into. Climate change, the concept of, does it exist? Are we responsible? I mean, you can just look at the weather and look at how things are changing around us year after year, and you don't really need to look for much evidence beyond that. It's a question of what do we do about that, and how severe is it going to get? And those are questions that, I certainly can't answer.
Right.
So those are ones that are probably the biggest challenges. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of these things that many people that are in the fold of the museum are aware of when it comes to invasive species, they'll have an understanding of that. But I don't think people quite often really realize how much that can change our environment around us. And if you were to allow this type of grass to go unabated, just imagine eliminating saguaros and turning this into a Sonoran grassland. It's a very different environment, and just as far as being attractive to outsiders, it's not going to have the same draw as what we have now.
Okay, let's do a couple more. One question about Priscilla Baldwin, how she did her art. Was it from life or still photographs?
So maybe I'll take that. Priscilla, she actually started with botanical illustration. And a really funny thing that kind of led her down this path of thinking about conservation is that she was doing, with botanical, they can have live specimens that they're working from. And she was doing a painting, and there was I believe it was a wasp that kept landing on her painting. And it was annoying her because she's like, this thing's getting in my way. But then when she found out, when somebody said, well, what it's doing is it's actually trying to pollinate your flower, it really kind of turned things around for her. She goes, oh my gosh. And she started learning about pollinators and then threatened and endangered species. And that's what led to her wanting to found this program, saying, we need to have more people understand these relationships.
Amazing. So last question, unless anyone has any more they want to type in. When will the docents return to the Desert Museum?
The docents are back.
Oh, they're back.
Yep, we went, of course, we were closed down during the pandemic, the early days from March through June of 2020. But even after that, once we opened, because of the being cautious about COVID, we kept the docents and most of our other volunteers away for over a year, but they're back now. And you'll see them on grounds. And of course, because many of them were gone for so long, then they have to go through refresher training when it comes to handling animals and so forth. So you might see them doing different things than they did in the past, but eventually we'll be back to full strength.
Right, awesome. And this kind of goes with the COVID thing. Have there been any unexpected animal behavior at the museum during COVID?
Not that I'm aware of. I know there were some zoos that were thinking that they saw evidence of animals missing people, but there was a study done at the Lincoln Park Zoo, and they really didn't see any evidence that supported that they were necessarily missing people. Um, you know, we'd all love to think that they want to see each and every one of us as that we go through an organization. Some of them definitely acclimate and get used to being around people, and others, they don't seem to care one way or the other. So I'm not aware of any actual peer-reviewed information that would support that they were animals that were actually missing humans.
Interesting. Okay. Are there any upcoming events you guys are doing, physical events at the museum?
Yes, there are. So we just had one about a week ago that was called Wind Down with Wildlife. The next one is our annual Desert Gala, which is a huge fundraiser for us. And then as we look towards late spring, there will be other ones coming up. And of course, we're going to be returning to cool summer nights. So as we get into the June, July, August, and the hot days, on Saturday nights will be open until 9 p.m. So there'll be a lot going on, and there's indoor facilities that make it even easier to spend time out there in a comfortable way.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, I know I said the last one before, but this will be the last one. Do staff still care for animals like the badger at home, or is all care done within the museum confines?
Pretty much everything is done at the museum. There's been a lot of changes. I know that my wife wishes she had the opportunities that Peggy had. We've never had a badger in our house. I have my wild animal walking in front of me right now. It's a cat. But yeah, it's really rare for us to be able to actually have animals at somebody's home. Every once in a while, we'll have an animal that needs to be fed so often that an animal will go home with a staff member, but because of the USDA guidelines on how animals are actually supposed to be maintained, it really has become much more restrictive. So we just don't have the same opportunities that we used to.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. It was a really interesting presentation and amazing new book. If everyone could go out and buy it and support the Desert Museum. Also, I want to thank everyone for taking the time today to log on to our first author salon of the 2022 season. And I would encourage everyone to visit our website, the PimaLibraryFoundation.org, for more info and ways to help support our mission and for future upcoming events we put on. So with that, I think we'll close it out for the night. And thank you, everyone, and good evening.